Okay, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Anita, for that introduction and for inviting me here today. And thank you to Gary for being in charge of my PowerPoint. I'd like to apologize to everybody for my voice. I have lost my voice because of fall allergies, but I'm feeling fine. So I figured I could also just power through this presentation today. Your all's group sounds very interesting, and I don't know if I could also be welcomed for Bocce and Tai Chi, but they sound very, very fun and interesting. So you might see me tagging along. But yes, so a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Northern Virginia. My family and I live now in Arlington. I live here with my husband and our two kids. I have a 4-year-old daughter and a 4-month-old son. I have a master's in museum studies and a PhD in history. I've been working in different segments of public history for museums, the National Park Service, the Historic American Building Survey, and the Smithsonian since 2009. So very enthusiastic about the possibility to teach folks about local as well as national and even international history, so people can really see the ways in which the individual experience is also universal, and how the universal experience can really be impacted on the individual level. So that's just a little bit about me. And as was said, I'm going to be doing a presentation about how the exhibitions that you all see on the mall specifically come to be. So if we want to go ahead and start the presentation, we could start just on slide 2. Give that a second. Great. So let me. So a bit about the National Museum of African American History and Culture, hereafter called NAMAC. In September of 2016, the museum opened. It was the newest Smithsonian on the National Mall. The journey from conception to actual museum actually started way 100 years prior, back in 1915. That was when the first individuals and organizations began to form to raise money to open this museum on the mall. The small circular artifact you can see on your screen is a part of our collection, which was a sort of piggy bank to take donations at that time to try and get that museum going. These efforts kind of hit different fits and starts until in 2003, when then President George W. Bush signed an act of Congress to establish NAMAC. And it was chosen for the museum to be on the very historic grounds of the Washington Monument, which in many ways was a symbolic act, as that's at the historical core of Washington, D.C. And the Washington Monument was the first monument erected on the mall. And it is obviously dedicated to George Washington, our first president and one of our nation's founders. And in that way, you see sort of a full circle connection between the founding of our nation, of which African Americans played a fundamental role, and also a link back to our failure at our founding to deal with the original sin of slavery and how that connection had ramifications through the centuries. Also in this slide, you see early sketches of designs for the museum, as well as a African crown or corona, which was one of the design inspirations for the museum. So if we could go to the next slide. The museum seeks to tell the American story through the African American lens. With my role at the museum, I primarily work in collections management and acquisitions for the curatorial team. We have a very proactive collecting policy. Namaque is distinct from all of the other Smithsonians in that when it was decided to open the museum, we did not have a founding collection. So that was a rather daunting task to establish a collection entirely from scratch. But what we really found was an if you build it, he will come scenario where donors, both big and small, began to reach out to us with both funds as well as items. The vast majority of our collections come from individuals and families who had been saving objects from their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and really holding on to them, passing them through generations with the hope that they could maybe be shared more broadly in the future, and then really entrusting us to tell those stories and to tell them with respect. And today we have more than 40,000 artifacts within the collection. So from 0 in 2003, we now have more than 40,000. So if we could go to the next slide. Before we get into the actual exhibitions, how the objects are displayed, I thought people might be interested to hear a bit about how the objects actually come into our collections and how we decide whether or not to accept them. So first we go about finding the materials, which we might find for sale through an auction house, from an estate sale, perhaps a different museum is closing and is looking to rehouse their objects. They also come to us through donations. We have an online donation portal where about 100 objects a week are offered to us from the general public. This includes details about the item, its size, its pictures of the material. So once we have that sort of initial review, we'll reach out to the individuals offering the materials and we'll do a fair bit of research about the object itself, where it fits in to a historical narrative, a historical timeline, how it fits with the museum's collecting policy. It might be that the object has significance, but that it doesn't fit with our current curators' visions for their collecting plans. So until very recently, for example, we didn't have a dedicated women's history curator, and we didn't have a dedicated military history curator. So some of those objects would be kind of, they wouldn't necessarily have a home with us. So it depends on having the person, the curator, whose vision matches the object and vice versa. We also like to do research at that stage about provenance, where the object came from. Is there a clear lineage for how the individual came to have the object? And in that stage, we like to get a bit about authenticity, about whether or not we think the object actually fits with the time and place that it alleges it has come from. So if it passes muster up to that point, then we will have the materials professionally shipped to an offsite warehouse, which it's the Smithsonian. which we run in Maryland. And it will be reviewed by myself, by our curator team, as well as by professional conservators who will look at what kind of shape the object is in. When we're deciding whether or not we want to accession an object to bring it into our collection, one of the considerations is its condition. What kind of issues does the material have? Is it moldy? Did it have at one point rodents or insects? Will those issues present a safety hazard? How much does it cost to reverse those issues? When we take on collections, we agree to care for them in perpetuity, which basically is, as long as there is a Smithsonian, we guarantee we're gonna take care of these materials. So if there's something that's in really bad shape or something that will degrade very rapidly, that doesn't mean that we won't take them, but it means we need to keep into consideration the long-term cost of the items. So you need to make sure that we have those sort of behind the scenes prep in mind. You need to justify those costs. And something else that's very significant, particularly for our museum, is the sensitivity of the object. And that is, there are lots of things within our collection that deal with slavery and the enslaved, lots of things that deal with racialized violence and lynchings. We want to make sure that if we're bringing materials into our collection, that we've thought about the ramifications for their display. And again, same with the condition assessment. If something is sensitive, that doesn't mean that we will not collect it. Just means we need to think about the broader ramifications of how it may be felt both by the African American community and by the larger audience. And so that's just the collections process. So then moving on to the next slide. Once an item is actually accepted into our collection, it could go into our long-term storage. A majority of the objects within our collection, about 90% will be in storage, only about 10% will be on display. But we also have specific collections for archivists, for researchers. We have a library. We also have a commitment to digitizing all of our items. So even though there's quite the backlog of the 40,000, we are committed to eventually having all of our objects professionally photographed and available for public view through our website. And through all of these various means of display, there's a commitment to telling stories of both major historical figures as well as common man and woman. There's also a balance between recognizing the extreme hardships faced by the African American community and also celebrating the personal, social, and political and cultural successes of the group, to really see the ways in which American history is African American history and African American history is American history. So these objects and these stories can be told through both permanent and temporary exhibitions. And I'm going to talk to you now about one such temporary exhibition, which I am on the team that is creating. And that is the Afrofuturism temporary exhibition, which will open in March of 2023. And I see that there's a question about the objects not displayed. Hold on one second. Going to take a water break and hope that it helps with my voice. So our the Smithsonian's objects that are not currently on display are stored off-site in Maryland We have a very large warehouse that is temperature controlled and climate controlled, that has a very robust fire safety system, that we house the materials in dark settings where they're often laid flat to preserve them for as long as possible. So it's conditions that are best for the objects. And yes, so does that answer that question, or does anyone have any else about the objects before we move in?
Yeah, I think you've answered it.
Great. All right, so if we could go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, I'm on the curatorial team for the Afrofuturism temporary exhibition. And if folks aren't familiar with that term, Afrofuturism is an evolving concept expressed through the Black cultural lens, which reimagines, reinterprets, and reframes the past, present, and future of the African American experience. So this was a term coined in 1993 by a academic named Mark Derry. It started out as sort of a scholarly framework for Black writers and artists for how they explore and utilize themes of technology, science fiction, fantasy, and heroism to envision stories and futures of Black liberation to convey authentic, hopeful, and culturally expansive images of the Black experience. Today, Afrofuturism has far surpassed those boundaries of scholarship, and it has emerged as not just an academic trend, but is truly an influential driver of African American culture, which has historic roots that stretch both across time and space, which is it kind of can be hard to pin down in some ways, because Afrofuturism is a concept, it's a philosophy, it's a genre. It's used by thinkers and artists and activists as a platform to understand and interpret the history of race and Black cultural identity. So with this ability to draw on so many different facets of the Black experience, it's a really powerful lens to view and interpret the African American experience in a increasingly technological world. So if we could go.
Questions, Lindsey,
Okay.
I think tie into what you just said. The first one was, how do you inventory all of these objects so that you know what you have and what you want to bring into the museum for various shows?
Yes. So an important part of these shows is first researching what we already have and also trying to figure out what we would want to tell the stories that curators would like to tell, and then what's actually out there. So the very first step is knowing what we have. Museums have various archival systems through which to determine what they have. The Smithsonian uses a system called TMS, which literally just stands for the museum system. I don't know what brilliant minds came up with that name, but it is a database which includes all of the objects within our collection, as well as the objects that have been offered for donation. So when I talked about the process before of being offered materials and then reviewing materials and then potentially collecting materials, each step of the way, our registrar's team is logging what those objects are, where they are housed, what condition they're in, what their size is. And so it is a very detailed process of keeping tabs on all of the items and bringing them through our process with the hope that it will never be sort of the end of Indiana Jones, this sort of like vast box being pushed through a sea of vast boxes. It's really, we have a very regimented sort of method in keeping them. Everyone in the museum field is very type A, and so it's sort of is able to go through that process.
The next question is, are all of the Smithsonian museums digitizing their collections in storage as well as those on display for online viewing?
I cannot speak to each individual museum's digitization plan. However, I do know that there is a commitment writ large to digitize our materials, especially in the wake of COVID-19. The idea that if people cannot come to our museums, we really want to make sure that our museums can come to them. We don't want to have a tight control on the knowledge. We want to share it broadly with the national and international audiences. But I do not know about the other Smithsonian's specific digitization plans.
Okay, getting back to Afrofuturism, is Micheline Thomas, a visual artist, an example of Afrofuturism?
I'm not familiar with that individual artist. But if as the presentation goes through, we're going to have some examples of things that are going to be on display. So that might indirectly answer that question.
Okay.
All right. So the images on this slide are Henrietta Lacks, which is a portrait within the Mox collection. And Henrietta Lacks was important in early scientific research. The HeLa cells is what it's known as, which developed vaccines. And Sun Ra, who is an artist, cultural thinker, whose music was done through the Sun Ra Orchestra, which I don't know if folks are familiar with. Those are the two images on the slide. So both of those are going to be used within the exhibition. All right, so going to the next slide.
Okay, we have another question. Do you visit other museums to get inspiration? The questioner had been to the African American Museum in Nashville and thought it was really excellent.
That's great. Yeah, curators and museum professionals definitely like to go out to see what's working, what's not working, what did they like, what did they not like, to be influenced by one another and support one another. So yes, you definitely do have those connections. However, every museum has its own scope, has its own goals, and has its own collections, which can really influence what and how things are interpreted. So sort of instead of standing on each other's shoulders, we're kind of standing on each other's feet to lift each other up. So it's sort of, there's sort of a stepwise contribution process. But yes, seeing what other museums did, which were well received or not well received, is an important process of the learning experience. So kind of to that end about external inspiration, a museum exhibition will start with the curator's initial idea about something that they are interested in, something that they feel passionately about. And from that initial idea, then you'll have academic research, looking at primary and secondary sources that deal with the topic to see what they have to say, and trying to figure out, based on that research, what do you want to say? What lens or new interpretation will you be able to add to it to justify an entire exhibition? Then from that theoretical background, you're going to need to look at objects. Looking through our TMS system, what objects do we already have? Are there enough materials to physically display to tell this story? And would that story fit within the museum's mission statement? Is there a public interest in this topic? Would the public be benefited from learning about this? And is it going to complement existing exhibitions without repeating what's already being said? Also, in looking at objects, you have to think about not only what's within our exhibition currently, but what is out there. If something is a great idea, but is exceptionally rare, and there's only 3 or 4 objects currently known out there that could be used to tell this story, well, then it's probably not a good fit for an exhibition. Probably would be a better fit for a journal article or a blog post. If you're not going to have things to show people, then you don't want to create an exhibition around it. And it takes years for this process. The Afrofuturism exhibition, for example, began in 2018, and it's not going to open until 2023. So that's a long time to sort of get all this going. The curators pictured on our screen are doctors Aaron Bryant, Michelle Williams, Katie Kendrick, and Spencer Crew, who are our curators of photography, LGBTQ, modern politics, architecture, visual design, collections, and 1968 and beyond, respectively. So moving on to the next slide. So with the academic underpinnings, the root of every exhibition is really objects, the stuff that people are going to see. So we'll look first to our own objects, what we have. And in the example of the Afrofuturism exhibition, we were lucky enough to already have some really exciting objects that could be used to tell this story. We had, for example, George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelics mothership, which is a large UFO type object that they would use in their stage shows in the 1960s and 70s to literally beam into the stage. That is already within Namak's collection. It's currently on display within our musical Crossroads. So we would be able to cross-pollinate from other exhibitions to use the objects. We also have the late Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther costume from Disney Marvel. which could be displayed. These objects are fun, they're visually interesting, and best of all, we already own them. So those are examples of objects that were good fits that we knew we could use within the exhibition. That's the easiest group. The next group that's quite easy to get our hands on are objects that are within other Smithsonians. The Smithsonians try very hard to always work together to lend each other objects to make sure that we have an open lending policy where things are seen as ours instead of mine. And so we work to try to get items from other museums. Again, as an example, for this exhibition, we looked to African art, who had this beautiful painting, which is called Stargazers, which links back to an African cultural tradition of future telling and storytelling, astrological projection. And those roots it's called African cultural astronomy. So they had a beautiful artistic representation of that, which we are borrowing for the exhibition. And then the Anacostia Community Museum, which is also a Smithsonian, had the science fiction writer Octavia Butler's typewriter, which is another example of Afrofuturist literature. So you have these sort of diverse threads. You can use these very different objects from very different time periods to tell this story. So those materials are on loan for us from different Smithsonians. The Stargazers object is on loan from African Art, the African Art Smithsonian, also in the mall. So then moving on to the next slide. You also have external loans. For these, it's all about research, finding those connections to other individuals, other artists, other collectors to try to create those relationships. It also ties into how curators visit other museums for inspiration. You also want to create good relationships with other institutions and individuals. We, for example, are for Afrofuturism have objects from the Museum of Popular Culture out in Los Angeles. They have a very robust Jimi Hendrix collection. So we are borrowing this kimono, which is pictured on the right here, which Jimi Hendrix wore on stage, and will be on display within our musical Sonic, it's called Sonic Architects, is the music section of our exhibition. So these relationships are not only with the people who, the museums who currently house the objects, but we have to make sure we reach out to donors and donors' families, estates. The Octavia Butler typewriter, for example, the Octavia Butler estate, which is made up of her family, they're still very active in her objects. So we need to make sure that we're letting these folks know how we're using the objects, how it's being used, and to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with all of these objects that have histories, old and new. We have materials within this collection, within this exhibition, that are related to Andre 3000 from Outcast, who is also pictured here, who our music curator, Timothy Burnside, has a very good relationship with. So we need to make sure that we're always cultivating those things to try and find out about these objects and whether or not folks are willing to loan them or donate them. They also need to be reviewed by our conservators so that we can get an understanding for the fragility of the objects and how they need to be displayed. What are lighting concerns? We're going to have to make custom display cases as well as custom display busts for these materials to ensure that they are not damaged or ripped in any way. We want to make sure that the objects are displayed safely and responsibly. Also because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago in talking about the conservator's goal of keeping these objects in perpetuity, we want to make sure that we don't use an object in a way that is too rough now, so that a different curator in 100 years could use that same object for their exhibition. So we want to just really always try to use the objects in a way which is educational for the public now, but responsible for the public later. Next slide, or any questions?
And Lindsey, just so you know, we're about 10 minutes to 11.
Okay. Well, I think kind of the last things that I would make sure that I want to touch on is the fact that I'm talking about this from a curator's point of view, because that's what I am, but tons of people go into creating an exhibition. The purple square on this screen, that's our physical exhibition space. And it is just a blank space. It is just a rectangle. And all of these different exhibitions are housed in that same space. We have some different pictures here from the World War I exhibition, as well as the one that dealt with Oprah Winfrey's impact on media. Those are exceptionally different topics. That meant our interior design team needed to figure out how to use that space to communicate different things to the visitor. In the case of World War I, it had a lot of sharp angles, which was designed to throw off visitors so they wouldn't know where they were spatially, to communicate a feel of trench warfare. You're moving through the trenches. But with the Oprah exhibition, we wanted the visitor to feel as if they were an audience in her studio. So our design team really thinks about those, how the physical space can help tell the curator's story. Moving on to the next slide. The designers also have to think about colors, design, accessibility, what we're attempting to communicate to the audience, and how our texts and textures can communicate that to people. We also want to think about soundscapes, how we can, if music, for example, is very important to the storytelling, as it is with Afrofuturism, we want to make sure that we could maybe share that music, but without being overwhelming to those with different sensory needs, but also being loud enough that those with potential hearing loss can still feel as if they can participate fully in the space. So this is a huge team of designers and graphic designers, folks who are in charge of copyright and citation, making sure that we're allowed to use these different things that we want to put up. And then just the diverse groups of also education, outreach, creating public programs, and that just broader team. I know I'm giving them sort of short shrift. If we want to go to the next slide, just a brief layout of what's actually within this exhibition starts with African legacies, looking at the historical roots of Afrofuturism, before moving on to New Black Futures, which deals with a post-World War II understanding of how the atomic age propelled Americans and African Americans into sort of a new future of trying to grapple with how life and science and technology were all used. That experience can very much be seen in literature and Black sci-fi, as well as comics and music, before moving on to our third and final section within the exhibition, which deals with Black worlds in terms of both world building in movies and TV, Black superheroes, as well as world building through architecture, visual art, fashion, design. And then world is a much more literal sense of NASA and Black astronauts. Nichelle Nichols, for example, as Uhura in Star Wars, had a very meaningful impact on Black cultural Afrofuturism. She's her costume is used in the space. So that's kind of how our exhibition will be presented. And just making sure that we have the sort of last 5 minutes for questions. I think that that's sort of the last things I want to make sure you know about the exhibition. We could just go to the next slide and I can take questions. Are there any questions for our last 5 minutes?
Yes. One is, what is the ballpark cost for repairing and conserving the items you've worked with? Is there a range of expenses?
There's a huge range of expenses. And it's large, but I do not know. The budget is something that I don't actually need to deal with in my job. And so I just choose to not have to think about it at all. But it is a lot of money to preserve, to repair and then preserve the materials.
What is the museum's current attendance policy? Do you still require advance reservations and timed tickets, or can anybody just walk in?
It is in the process of changing from tickets as a COVID protocol to a more relaxed entry. But as this group is local, there are always day of tickets where you could stop by to see if there are tickets available. It was that odd thing where as soon as the museum transitioned off of tickets following our high demand after our opening, COVID hit. And then we first closed and then opened with very limited time tickets. So it's been this sort of odd ticketed experience since 2016.
Okay, somebody said, just an observation, the gray on gray text looks great, but can be hard to read for people with vision issues. Well, I don't know if you have a comment on that. next comment is the North Bethesda Village is doing a presentation tomorrow on the origins of jazz that includes Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong. Pat, I don't know if you've got a Zoom link or contact information. And somebody said, asking again, do you have to have a reservation? They must have missed that answer. And it sounds like what you said is there are day of tickets. You can just walk up and get tickets more readily now than used to be the case.
Yeah, and I'd also just check our website, as folks are anticipating a COVID surge. Say continue to look just to confirm, but yes, there should be day of.
How far in advance can you reserve a slot?
I don't know.
Okay, Gary, why don't we stop recording, and we'll thank Lindsey, Dr. Bestebreurtje. This has been really excellent, and we will keep the slides. What is the interest that you have in Arlington and the